So to start out with a more optimistic perspective here, I'm going to argue that Southeast Asia is going to be, in the near future, along with South Asia, a major source of growth in the world economy. Southeast Asia is an area of bewildering diversity, thousands of languages, many different ethnicities, and some of them just merely tribal, and abundant natural resources, not fully exploited, and fully tapped. It's geographically divided between mainland and maritime sectors. It's a trade route between Africa and the Middle East and East Asia, Northeast Asia, and a meeting point between these dynamic economies. About 625 million people, a larger labor base than either the United States or even the European Union. Not as large as China or India, of course, but still the third largest in the world in terms of labor base. And it's a dynamic labor base with over half the population under 40 years of age. It's relatively high growth rates recently, and I think they'll go up. There's already been a considerable displacement of economies from China to Southeast Asia to escape the tariffs, the Trump tariffs. And it's the third largest GDP in the world after China and Japan. In terms of, if you aggregate all of 10 major economies of Southeast Asia into ASEAN. And its net FDI flow into Southeast Asia is rising. And I think that's a key to its increasing economic power in the world. That shows it is the fifth largest in the world, third largest in Asia, third largest economy in Asia, fifth largest in the world. This is the trend of GDP annual growth in Southeast Asia. And this is the number of Southeast Asian venture capital deals in recent periods. So it's a growing area of high-tech investment in Southeast Asia, especially Singapore. FDI flows into ASEAN member states are mostly in Singapore, as you can see here. And share of FDI source countries, you can see that although China has overtaken the US in terms of trade, Japan is still a major trader in all of the Southeast Asian countries. It was once dominant in Southeast Asia. Despite its imperialist background in World War II, it's recovered its economic dominance in Southeast Asia, but it's been overtaken, I think, by China in terms of trade. But in terms of investment, it's still well behind US and Japan in Southeast Asia. So you don't forget investment. Investment is still important in terms of how much money you have from these various countries. So I think Southeast Asia's economic position going forward is quite strong. Geopolitically, it's much weaker, of course. It's the weakest. It's weaker than China. It's weaker than the US. Historically, it hasn't been a threat to outside neighbors. Unlike Northeast Asia has been sometimes a threat to other countries, Southeast Asia has never been a threat outside. Most of its wars have been internal among Southeast Asian countries historically because of its fragmentation. It's never been strong enough. No single country down there has been strong enough to go out and try to conquer the world the way the Mongolia did under Genghis Khan and his descendants. It's been threatened by first Northeast Asia and then by Europe, of course, which colonized every Southeast Asian country except Thailand during the 19th century, and by Japan in World War II. It's been conquered Japan conquered most of Southeast Asia. Since World War II, it has sought security via consensus around an ideology of peace and cooperation as embodied in the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, or as the constitutional foundation document for the 10 major economies of Southeast Asia. Only 2 countries in Southeast Asia are not yet members of the Southeast Asian or the ASEAN community, and they both applied. This is so it's all of the major economies of Southeast Asia. Internally, this has been quite successful. There have been no wars in Southeast Asia since the formation of ASEAN in 1967. There have been disputes, but no wars. And Burma was brought back in, is now Myanmar, as democracy and elections were encouraged in Myanmar around this common ideology and so forth. And so it's had a sort of interesting, since its formation in 1967, especially since the Cold War, ASEAN has had a sort of imperialist, neo-imperialist strategy of spreading its influence through its ideology and through convening meetings, sort of co-opting all the major powers that tend to threaten it. So like the ASEAN Regional Forum, or ARF, the ASEAN meetings with Europe, the East Asian Summit, which is organized by ASEAN. ASEAN chairs all of these organizations. So it maintains ASEAN centrality, which is one of the basic principles of ASEAN. That ASEAN centrality should be center, whatever the center of ASEAN is much more vague, but it's trying to be center in the rest of Asia to try to sort of export its ideology and encourage people to come in under its leadership. So this is, in terms of power politics, what this conference is organized around is the idea that power politics has returned to Asia very much, and that how does ASEAN react to power politics? The major threats to ASEAN are 3. That's US, Japan, and China. I might mention India, but unfortunately India has not yet emerged as a major power in ASEAN. They've had this aspiration, go east or act east under Modi, has been to act east, to try to be more assertive in Southeast Asia, but it's never really taken place. I mean, India still remains the least globalized major country in the world. It has had a lot of trouble globalizing, and that is to open to outside world. It still has relatively high tariff or non-tariff barriers, and so it hasn't really made its presence felt in Southeast Asia. It has the aspiration to do so. It has made some moves in that way, but not in a major way. So the major 3 powers in terms of power politics towards Southeast Asia remain Japan, China, and the United States. And let's see. These are the major powers, Japan, China, and the US. So let's go through each one of these. First with China. China has, in the Maoist era, recognized and tried to assist movements, national liberation movements in various Southeast Asian countries. Most successfully in Vietnam. That's the only major success story that China had in Southeast Asia, despite many, many attempts in Cambodia, Laos, Burma, Malaysia, Philippines. They had active communist parties. China assisted, both in terms logistically and ideologically. They're still in Nepal, parts of northern India, and so forth. But this revolutionary attempt to try to sum up, has not been very successful. Even in terms of Vietnam, they invaded Vietnam just 4 years after, 75, 78, 4 years after they helped liberate Vietnam from the Americans. They invaded it in a border dispute, so their assistance to revolution in Vietnam have limited effect. In the 1990s, provoked largely by the constraints of the developed countries, which had been major importers from China and China's export-oriented growth strategy, they all try to isolate China after Tiananmen, the Tiananmen crackdown, human rights violations and so forth. And so China turned to its periphery and to the developing countries to try to sort of compensate for its ostracism by the developed world. And they started a charm campaign in Southeast Asia. This was quite successful. They did win over recognition from all of the Southeast Asian countries in the early 1990s. And in the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, China successfully supported the Southeast Asian countries against the somewhat fiscally more conservative IMF, International Monetary Fund policy to Southeast Asian countries were grateful to China for that. And in 2009, China embraced the ASEAN. In the early 1990s, in 1992, they supported having a declaration on policy towards code of conduct, a non-binding declaration on code of conduct, and they've been negotiating on a actually binding code of conduct ever since that time. 5 minutes, and so they were quite successful in establishing good relations with ASEAN. They have ASEAN-China FTA, but then as the core interests came up, the question of the South China Sea, they've reinterpreted their policy toward multilateral relations with ASEAN to take a more bilateral stance, and they've urged all the ASEAN countries to negotiate bilaterally with China over the South China Sea claims. That makes a certain amount of sense because, after all, ASEAN doesn't claim any of those islands itself. ASEAN is just a collection of nation states, and only nation states can make claims. Anyway, they've changed their strategy towards multilateral organizations. 2013, Maritime Silk Road began in Southeast Asia. So the Chinese foreign policy, I don't know where this, somehow these, it's not very well organized PowerPoint here. It includes, certainly China's foreign policy includes two major initiatives since the rise of Xi Jinping. One, or since 2009, one is, as we've talked about before, the Chinese territorial claims to the South China Sea, which are based on the 9-dash line and so forth. Now, these go back to 1947, of course, but they were never enforced by either China or by Taiwan until after 2009, after the global financial crisis inspired China with much more greater confidence that they could make their claims enforceable. And the second was the Belt Road Initiative. And I argued that that was partly based on the attempt to sort of compensate for the not making friends with Southeast Asia with their 9-dash line claims. I could be wrong, but you can read into the minds of the Chinese thinkers. I don't know. So these are the this is the 9-dash line, and this is the Belt Road Initiative. You can see. I think the overland thing was inspired by Wang Qi, but the Southeast Asian thing, I think that was Xi Jinping, and it's based on the need to overcome this sense of suspicion aroused by the Chinese claims on the territory. U.S. policy has been benign, but completely inconsistent. It tends to react to perceived threats, and does in a military way, highly militarized way, and then to withdraw. Economic trade has been also inconsistent, but it's based on economic opportunities rather than political factors. It has nothing to do with politics at all. And China has overtaken the U.S. in terms of trade, but not in terms of investment. U.S. is also a bigger investor than China in Southeast Asia, and it's often underestimated. So we have two triangles, and basically, I think one is and both of which ASEAN tries to play a romantic triangle. In other words, to court both sides of the triangle, both China and the US. One's an Asian triangle and one's an international triangle. If it comes to a hard threat to Southeast Asian countries, they have no option but to go to the international triangle, because Japan, due to Article 9 and to the sort of peace lobby in Japan, very hard to overcome, will not respond. They've tried to do this under Abe to some extent by selling weapons, but they have had very little success at that. So their only option is to go to the United States and to help. But that would be, to go to the United States for help is a risky deal. I mean, Vietnam was left in ruins, and so it's got a lot of drawbacks. So for many of these Southeast Asian countries, I think it would be more attractive to go to this Japan triangle, the local triangle, to try to put Japan against China. And that's been more attractive to many Southeast Asian countries, because Japan is still an active player in the Southeast Asian. And under Abe, they've made a comeback. Japan is much more vigorous economically in Southeast Asia now, and they've got major investments in all the Southeast Asian countries. They've got several advantages over the U.S. One is that they're local, and so it's part of the neighborhood. Japan's part of the neighborhood, and so their credibility is greater. When they say we're sticking, our interests are much more inextricably involved, and we're going to stick here. We're going to be here in the future. So people can believe that more than the U.S., which has come and gone. And second, it has pursued a slightly different policy than the U.S. They're bound to the U.S. by treaty, yet they've always been much more willing to deal, much more willing to compromise. For example, in Vietnam, they came into Vietnam 1 year after the United States left, very bitterly left. And they never broke relations with Vietnam. They've always had good relations with Vietnam. 1976, they came in and offered aid to Vietnam, and they explained to the U.S., well, we're going to do this. This is part of our help. So they offered aid to Vietnam. That's when they helped with the confrontasi between Malaysia and Indonesia earlier. And as you know, they've been into Burma. They never broke relations with Burma when Burma was being sanctioned by everybody else. So they're much more sort of conciliatory. They've worked very closely with ASEAN. So I think that might be where much, but the basic sort of principle that Southeast Asian will consistently pursue, I think, is to avoid choice. That's worked for them in the past. They've avoided choice even when their own interests were affected by the 9-dash line. They've tried to avoid making a choice, and if they'll put off a choice for just as long as they possibly can. Will the trade war push them to make a choice? If the trade war goes bad, if the trade war goes towards a basic decoupling of the two economies, which I think is a possibility, I think I disagree with Professor Paltiel in that respect. I think that's a definite possibility. If it's not resolved conclusively, there will be a tendency for firms to move out of China into other more friendly territory, either Southeast Asia or coming back home or things like that. So that is a definite possibility. If that happens, then Southeast Asia will indeed be forced or pushed in the direction of having to make a choice. Which one will they choose? They have very strong economic relations with China, no question about it. But they'll probably look for the winner, I think.